Welcome to each one of you. The murmur of friendship is always a nice sound. So thank you all for being here. At a time like this, Ellen White's quote of, "We have nothing to fear for the future, except we forget God's leading in our past history," certainly comes to mind. This afternoon, we're going to celebrate something that happened 50 years ago. Something that is, in my view, is probably one of the most monumental things that happened at this institution. Apart from when Loma Linda first began and started the purchase of the original buildings, the decision to move out here to Loma Linda to consolidate on one campus, made in the early part of the 60s, is probably one of the most significant things in this institution's history. And so even as we dream and start planning towards a new building, we felt it was appropriate to stop and pause and look back, because that's a very special history. Many of you know this story. Our board went back and forth, I don't know how many times, changing their minds, voting to go to the city, voting to go to Loma Linda, voting back to go to the city, went back and forth for some years, until finally the young chairman of surgery was appointed dean of the School of Medicine and says, "We have no choice, we must make a decision." And Dr. Hinshaw made that decision, and the institution followed. We're going to celebrate that history this afternoon, a very special way that God has led this institution in a very important way. And even as we now look at a new hospital in the future, it would not have happened had that decision not been made 50 years ago. So thank you all for being here. We're going to go through a series of videos and interviews of some of the people that lived through those times and celebrated that particular event. Let's pray together as we begin. Our gracious Father in heaven, we come to you this afternoon both excited but sobered by the world in which we live, by the turmoil around us. We think especially of our fellow citizens in Texas this afternoon, suffering from Hurricane Harvey and the flooding, while we sit in California heat. And yet this afternoon, Father, we want to look back and marvel at the way you've guided this place for so long. It's now been 112 years that you have guided, made decisions, and helped those in various positions to move forward. Thank you for giving many of us the privilege of being a part of this institution. And now as we look back, celebrate and remember, we place the future in your hands as well, Father. We pray these things in your name. Amen. Enjoy.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations.
The 1960s were a tumultuous time for this country. You had all of the controversy over the Vietnam War, the racial tensions that existed in this country.
It may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words of the bad people and the violent actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence and indifference of the good people.
But we also know that only those who dare to fail greatly can ever achieve greatly.
The factions that developed over how we should operate as a society, all of the controversy over the redesign of healthcare.
The Harry S. Truman Library at Independence, Missouri is the scene of an historic event. President and Mrs. Johnson and Vice President Humphrey arrive for ceremonies that will make the Medicare bill a part of Social Security coverage.
Medicare changed everything. Medicare was going to change how we practice medicine.
In a way, I look back and say it was providential. Having Medicare gave us hope that there would be a way to finance a practice if we moved to Loma Linda.
For 50, 55 years, students spent the first 2 years on the farm and the last 2 years in the city. and actually worked out very well. However, the accrediting bodies, they said you cannot really integrate the sciences with the clinical experience being 60 miles apart.
So pressure was being put on all the schools across the country who were on split campuses, of which we were one. Stanford University was this way. So here we were, we're 60 miles apart. What are we going to do? And it began to be a consistently appearing accreditation issue. Stanford had made their decision, and they were in the process of moving to Palo Alto.
And they just came right out and said, you're the only medical school left in the United States with 2 campuses. You're going to have to get together. We got Stanford together, and you're going to get together. Well, you know, you mention Stanford, everybody starts to shiver.
The question was, should the school unite on the Loma Linda campus or White Memorial and the LA campus?
All of the pressure was to move the medical school to Los Angeles.
You got to imagine Loma Linda in the 1950s and 60s. I mean, it was small. When you got a small community, which is nicknamed the farm, there's not a lot of opportunities for clinical experience.
So this became very intense, and committee after committee was appointed. Nobody could make a decision about anything. It was just too delicate. I said, there has to be a clear-cut decision made, or the school is finished. It'll never survive.
Well, initially I thought because of the training program for clinicians and the use of the LA County Hospital with White Memorial, that it seemed like the move should be to Los Angeles. But then I began to realize and wanted to deal with the issue of what did God want us to do? And I came to the conclusion that the move should be in this direction if Dr. Hinshaw and others thought it could be accomplished.
I said, I believe it can be done if the church gets behind it, and I believe it's the right thing to do.
Dr. Hinshaw said it is possible, we can do it. So many people said, no, it's impossible.
The decision went back and forth, but eventually settled on the fact that the move should be to Loma Linda.
They called an emergency meeting that night of the medical staff. Everybody thought this was the end of the school, that obviously I had lost my mind. So this was the state of affairs.
Well, at first I thought this is never going to work. Some people were grossly unhappy, and some people left.
My father kept coming home and saying, we need to consider moving to Loma Linda. Now, I didn't really understand at that time the school consolidating, things like that. I just knew that I liked living here, and Loma Linda was out there, and I didn't want to go out there.
It was not a popular move with the clinicians. It wasn't popular at all, and very unpopular.
When the medical school decided to move out here, the local doctors were not very happy. They weren't anxious for Loma Linda to come out.
And of course, there were several things that were quickly evident. One was that a new medical center had to be built. How are you going to staff this place? I mean, are there going to be any patients out here?
There was uncertainty in our minds, but one of the things that was a great encouragement is that we could be up on the hill near the Loma Linda Sanitarium and Hospital. We could look down the hill and see the hole being dug for building the new medical center. Being able to look down and see that going gave us courage and hope that there'd be something better downstream.
It was successful, primarily because God was behind this, but secondarily because there was a critical mass, not a large number, but a critical mass of the clinical faculty in Los Angeles who agreed with Dr. Hinshaw that the future is in Loma Linda. They came out here, they left lucrative practices, successful practices, to join the farm. And they made it work. They made it work.
So how do you begin to tell a story like that? And we want to start with children of the faculty who were here at that point in time. This means you all must be at least 50 years old. Got that right? Most of you will recognize these folk, but let me go through. Dr. Richard Shinnick, son of Bob Shinnick, who was our chair of pediatrics at that time. Patty Catalano, son of Dr. Lou Smith, one of our surgeons at that time. Jeff Thompson, son of Dr. Ralph Thompson, you saw in the video, is here. Dr. Dave Hinshaw, chair of radiology, and of course his father, David Hinshaw Sr. Jay Jutsi, son of Dr. Roy Jutsi, and Robert Rosenquist, son of Bob Rosenquist. So these were faculty kids who grew up during that time. And I don't know who has a mic.
I do.
You do. Let's start with you, Jay.
Right.
I've heard you tell some stories about those old days back at that point in time. Share with us.
Yes. We moved to Loma Linda when I was 8 years old, and my dad was planning to go into private practice. Instead, he had the first 12 medical students that were their seniors that came out to Loma Linda as the first medical students to have their fourth clinical year at Loma Linda. They called him Roy Jutsi and his apostles. That's the house I grew up in. And I also grew up in a house literally right across the street from the lot where the new hospital was being built. When I was a little kid going to the swimming pool, it was orange groves that I used to play in. But as time went on, those cleared out, and we could watch the entire construction of the new hospital, and we were extremely proud. Like I said, growing up in the university family from a young age, I was very proud of the university and what it was doing. An incredible building was going up like nothing in the Inland Empire before, much as we see today. Very innovative for earthquake protection. So 50 years from now, we may be building a new hospital earthquake protection. But it was quite an impressive structure.
Tell the story about your dad.
Yeah, I want to get to the story about my dad. My dad used to walk to work on the hill. Cardiology was up at the old hospital. And he'd walk back and forth from home. And he always cut through the orange groves, or now an open field or excavated field, to walk to and from home. He left in the morning, went that way, and that night, late at night, what was completely dark night, he was trucking across the field and all of a sudden fell into a 20 to 30 foot hole. They dug the foundation of the hospital that day, and he didn't know it. When he came to, he was cuts and bruises and completely filthy from rolling down the dirt hill and into rocks and stuff. But what really scared him the most is there was no way out. He had to walk around the whole excavated site until he could find a corner where they'd made a pathway that you could get out of the hole.
Use a cell phone.
So, yeah, my family was up close and personal to the new building.
Very good. Thanks, Dave. Let me go to Dave Hinshaw next. Dave, we all credit your dad with the kind of the stubbornness, if I can say that, the guts to make this move. What was it like in the family? I mean, this must have been a discussion, a struggle as this decision was made.
It all went like this to some degree at that time. I had just graduated from La Sierra. I was working in the lab up here doing chromosome analysis. And when the move was coming, I helped to move the lab into the new building. This was 1 year before that. My wife and I were married. My wife was the daughter of Varner J. Johns, who came out here along with the core faculty to be chair of medicine and chief of cardiology. And so my wife and I celebrated our 51st anniversary this month. And we're kind of excited to see this whole process moving along. I've been on the faculty now for 43 years and a chair of radiology for 27 years. Getting just a little bit tired, but doing okay, you know. As far as what was happening at the time, I was just getting out of teenage years, and I knew this was all going on, but it was like a kind of a foreign land passing over my head.
Yeah, very good. Jeff, let me go to you. Your dad was one that made the big decision whether to come out or not, had an established practice in L.A., and Tell us about that decision.
Well, same thing. I think from a child's standpoint, it kind of went over our heads. All of a sudden, we were lumped together with 100 other kids in our high school class, of which 20 of them are physicians, all physicians' kids from other physicians' families that came out at the same time. So it was impressive to watch the hole being dug. I didn't know your dad fell in it, but to see the orange groves disappear and the monument go up, which I think is still one of the biggest buildings in the area. So now we're advancing again, and we've gotten to see all of this history. I have to say it was 57 degrees at my house this morning, and it's way too hot down here. But anyway, we did have great associations. All of our families and kids grew up together, and it's like a mini family reunion for us, isn't it?
Let me go back to Robert. Where was your family at that point in time, and what's your memories of your dad coming?
Well, I was born on the hospital on the hill, and we lived in Redlands. I saw most of the construction going on, playing wiffle ball with Jay and Ken Jutsi there on San Juan. We could see it going up, and up with many wiffle ball games, and it was very exciting. This was the biggest building in the Inland Empire. Also, they noticed that it probably would be a good idea to get an overpass over the railroad tracks on Anderson Street, because hospital ambulances coming to the hospital would be stopped by a train. So that also turned into a real gold mine for the city, apparently, because they put the 35-mile-an-hour speed limit there, and the police were very vigilant in enforcing that. They would sit on the downhill side and give ticket after ticket after ticket for people going 40 over the overpass. And I would throw in one other thing. My father was very happy to move into the new facility here. His practice office had been on one of the little side wings on the hospital on the hill. And at one point, on a day something like this, they didn't have adequate air conditioning in the side wing. And he and some of his colleagues had requested that they could perhaps get some air conditioning, please, for their comfort and the comfort of their patients. And they were told, "Oh, no, brother, that's just too extravagant. We can't spring for that." Sometime later that he went to the administrator's office about another matter, and the office was quite well air conditioned.
Very good. Let me come down to you, Dr. Chinnick. I can remember as a freshman medical sophomore, your dad giving some lectures to us. Actually, you reminded me on the old railroad tracks one winter, walking home from anatomy class in the winter. It was already dark by about 4:30. We lived down on Cole Street, I think it was caught by the academy. And some hobo, I guess, had just tried to jump the railroad, on a train, had fallen under it and had his head cut off, and was laying there in the railroad track. That's before they built the overpass up there. So, Richard, pediatrics back then was nothing like today.
Nothing. Thanks for letting me follow the decapitation story. Can only go up from there. So I just remember, I think like a lot of us, and of a certain age, I just remember there was this whole year when my dad commuted every day from LA to here. And coming out here, there were 6 pediatricians at the time. I think we just hit nearly 200 in the department. So just to watch and have a front row seat to that whole process has been pretty amazing.
Yeah. Patty, I didn't realize the history, but your dad did the first kidney transplant at Loma Linda in the old hospital just before the move. It was in the spring of '67. But tell us some of your recollections and the battle that went on in your family as far as whether to move.
The move. Yeah, I think my dad must have been at that meeting where they decided they would move, and he came home and told us we were moving. I wasn't very on board about that, but nobody cared about a 12-year-old. Yeah. And it all turned out good, but he didn't know if he could make a living out here, and right away they did very well.
Yeah. That was the issue, and I think we need to remember that a lot of clinicians put their careers on the line when they said, let us go out to the farm. Let us try to establish a practice out there and see it go. And as we'll see in some of the later videos, the hospital filled up almost immediately. So the fears were not founded, but they did not know that when they made the decision to move out here. So thank you all. Thank you all for your families and what you've done and contributed to this institution. And now we'll look at the move.
Based upon what I've seen, the transition from the Hill to the new building was probably almost a bigger change in facility than what we're going to be going through today. I can't imagine they had transition planning consultants 50 years ago, and now it's a whole industry.
I came to Loma Linda as a young faculty member. The date that I arrived was the very same date that the Cloverleaf buildings that we're celebrating today opened. My first day seeing patients was the first day that hospital opened, so we both were born at the Cloverleaf, as it were. The idea of moving a group of patients from one location to the other, whether it's just down the hall, across the street, or several hundred yards, as was the case at Loma Linda, is fraught with some anxiety. It sounds easy, but it really isn't. There was a surprisingly large group of critically ill patients at Hill Hospital who had to be moved, and it had to be done in a relatively rapid and organized way. It looked to the untrained eye as chaos. But if you looked for very long, you were reassured, and as the day went on, and certainly by the time the day was over, things had settled down, and it was a really peaceful transfer.
There's nothing that can stress you out more than recognizing that you have a huge stake in ownership of making sure a patient who is so incredibly vulnerable, they're at their most vulnerable point, and a safe, as painless as possible transition is part of your responsibility. Stress levels, through the roof.
The most tranquil of us all were the patients. They trusted what was going on. The whole transition was as painless as it could be. Only the Lord's blessing allowed that to happen. But a lot of the equipment that goes with patients runs on electricity. Lots of monitoring equipment comes to mind. Certainly in my field, oxygen, ventilators, so that some of the patients were literally bagged with a resuscitation bag in lieu of a ventilator as they were being transferred. Many patients in the critical care units, the nurse and the therapist that were there in one place just went right along with them and transferred the bed into the new units.
It's interesting to kind of think about the differences about what may have been occurring when the original building was built versus now. I think there's a huge amount of significant differences, and I think there's some things that might have been a little bit easier back then and some things that may have been a lot more difficult. I can't imagine how challenging that must have been back then 50 years ago. If things go well, you can step back and think, well, that was maybe not as difficult as we thought, but one small incident and things could go very wrong very quickly.
I was worried, and some of my colleagues were worried, that we would have a party and nobody would come. That was not the case. Patient count went up pretty quickly, and there was never an occupancy issue.
The thing that was so impressive is we went from 25 beds to over 100 beds overnight, and we were full from nearly day one on. The thing that I'm most appreciative of is Varner Johns was our chairman, and he really planned for the transition.
Once the operation was going, with just a few patients, it seemed to be so smooth that I was pretty confident things were going to be all right.
And we'd like to interview some more. Let me start over on this end. If you all could please stand, if you're still able. I think many of you recognize these gentlemen, Dr. Harvey Elder, Dr. Tom Godfrey, Dr. Irv Kuhn, and Dr. Bob Mitchell. These were some of the original faculty that came out and established a practice here. There's some others as well, and we'll recognize some a little bit later. But you are the ones that set up the system in this hospital. Talk to us about what that was like. Who has a microphone? Does anybody? Bob, why don't you go ahead and tell us, Bob, when you started in GI, where were you? You started, I think, up on the hill first, and then what was it like transitioning down to the new hospital?
Excuse me, I didn't.
What was it like to move from you were up on the hill first, in the cottages, I think?
That's right.
And then move the GI practice down here to the new hospital?
Well, it was very interesting and important to move down to the new facility. We enjoyed it very much and found it very challenging to work in the new hospital.
Thank you. And you established a GI lab down in the new hospital?
Yes, we did. I specialized in gastroenterology while we were still up on the hill, and I moved down as the first gastroenterologist in the new hospital.
Very good. And Dr. Kuhn, you brought hematology oncology to us.
I came from the University of Washington down here in August of '66. And the first office was up in the cottages outside of the hospital on the hill. Cottages were a little crowded, but they functioned reasonably well. Then in about the end of November, the first part of December of '66, I moved down into the new hospital facility. They said it was occupiable, and I was very eager to start a research lab over at the hospital, so I perhaps moved early. I think Ray Herber and I were the first ones in the new hospital, as I recall, research wing. But the interesting thing about that so from December until July, we were in the essentially new hospital without any patients and so on. They hadn't moved over yet. But the interesting thing about being in the new facility was that some days you'd come to the facility and you wanted to wear your swimsuit because it was so hot. And the next day you wanted to have 2 overcoats on because it was so cold. They were trying to balance the air conditioning system. So we weren't ever quite sure what weather we would meet in the new place.
Thank you. Dr. Godfrey, I can remember rotating on your service up on 9200, as I recall, and we started oncology at Loma Linda. Tell us about that.
Well, when I came down here from Northern California, where I was in practice with the hematologist at Stanford, and it was to build up the oncology practice down here, and it happened just overnight. We had an oncology ward of 26 beds, and I think we kept them full just about all the time. And in terms of referrals, there were no other medical oncologists in Southern California, except one at UCLA. So, immediately we began getting referrals, and out to Palm Springs, Las Vegas, and halfway into Los Angeles, these people all were referred in to us, and most of them really required just hospice care because we didn't have a whole lot that we could do for them. But there's a lot of physicians that did not want to be involved with hospice care, so we took them.
Yeah. Now, and I remember you working very hard. I was amazed even back as a student. Pretty soon you added another oncologist to the team?
We did have another oncologist, and over the years, 2 or 3 more oncologists.
Yeah. I can remember standing up on 9200 on your service, I think as an intern, don't remember for sure what year it was, when an earthquake hit. And you could look down the hall. For those of you who know the old hospital, the south tower is not tied to the other by design. So you could literally look down the wall and watch the walls going back and forth like this between the other towers and that tower. So incredible time. Dr. Elder, you came back in infectious disease from back east and started the service.
Let me tell you about that earthquake. I had just put my foot across that. So I was on both sides at the same time. It was a rather interesting experience I do not care to replicate. I want to back up just a little bit, if I may, Dick. I was in my fellowship in Boston. Stu Chanko was in St. Louis, and so was Ray Herber. And we would meet on Saturday night at the bus station in New York on the way to Atlantic City for the medicine meetings. And we would talk for the 6 hours of the trip. And what was so palpable was the excitement. And when I came in July of '67, right after the move, there was a level of excitement that I really haven't experienced otherwise. I mean, it was, we're doing it. It's going to happen. And it happened. It really occurred. And it was just, that excitement was just an incredible blessing, and it just drove us into doing it. Well, I arrived and I found out that the chief of pathology, Bill Thompson, had decided I was going to run an infection control committee. And microbiology, Ralph Winter said I was going to run it. I didn't know what an infection control committee was. I hardly knew how to spell it. So, you know, I did what you're supposed to do. I went to CDC, took a course, didn't like what they did. I thought it was useless, and pondered it. Went and visited a nurse who was doing it in Chicago. And she collected this data. And I said, what do you do with it? She pointed to her file drawer. It's there. Who reads it? Nobody. Well, I'm far too lazy for that. We're just not going to go there. And so I'm pondering what it should be, not really knowing. And at that point, the nursing service said, we have an excellent nurse who's looking for a job. Would you be able to use a good, I could use a good nurse, let me tell you. And so Gracie Morey came and worked with me as a nurse epidemiologist, and worked with me for 6 years. And she did such an incredible job that CDC asked her to come and work with them. So
Until you asked her to come back.
that was later.
They're now married.
We're now married. She's my wife. And it's been a great deal. Yeah. So infection control basically is what we did. We didn't have the money to do the research, and so what we worked on was how do you prevent the infections? And just one more thing on that, if I may. Compared to surgeries elsewhere, I'm talking about, we've talked about Stanford, Harvard, etc. The infection rate of our surgeons was less than half of the infection rates of their surgeons, which speaks to the quality of the surgeons who came out.
Very good. Thank you to each one of you. You can go ahead and have a seat, I think, if you want to now. It's people like these and many others that literally carry the burden of this new hospital on their backs, and we're deeply appreciative of the commitment that you all made. You all look a little bit younger. You can stand up now. So these were some of the first residents in the new hospital. And I think many of you recognize them. Monty Murdoch, John Hodgkin, good to see you, Johnny. Lynn Behrens, Dale Isaiah, and Burton Briggs. Lynn, you've got the microphone, and you were part of the move. Tell us a little bit about, she's got one herself. So tell us a little bit about the move and what you were doing at that point in time.
Pediatrics at that time occupied the penthouse on the old hospital. We had 8 beds, and the move was exciting and different. We were transported in the back of a moving van, so I was up near the front in between all of the cribs, and it was nearly a crisis when a child demanded to use the potty. But we made it down the hill in the back of the moving van. What I remembered was going down the corridor and the stripes on the carpet. But then the joy of entering 5300 and having 3 times the number of beds, which we so quickly filled that we started to metastasize to other units around. And the result is the wonderful Children's Hospital of today.
Yeah. Because really that first move was what led, and we'll hear more about this a little bit later, to eventually having a full children's hospital, which we didn't have at that point in time. Let me go, Dale, to you. You were here in internal medicine at that point in time, and then on into cardiology?
Yes, I was just starting my 2nd year of internal medicine when we made the move. And actually seeing the films today has really brought back a lot of good memories. Everyone needs to know and remember that even though we moved into a beautiful building, it's because of the giants who led us, who were inspired by God to do what they did. I remember Dr. Hinshaw coming. I was a sophomore medical student when he made the announcement to those of us who were still on the farm. He said, we're going to move out here, and Dr. Hinshaw, in his inimitable way, said, don't you worry about anything. You just worry about studying. And he was the kind of person who could get your attention, and so at that point I stopped worrying about what was going to happen.
So I hadn't heard that. So he actually came and talked to the medical students at Loma Linda.
That's correct.
Before
we thought at that time the decision had been made, we were going to LA. Didn't make a whole lot of difference to me at that point because I was a sophomore. I had to go to LA County anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But I was in the second group that came back to Riverside, and then I was the first straight internal medicine resident for Loma Linda University Medical Center.
Very good, very good. Let me go on, Burton, to you. Your dad was very significant in this discussion, as I recall, and kind of stood up and says, okay, count on me, I'm going.
That's correct. I was one of the 12 apostles, if you want to call them that. I felt more like a disciple than an apostle. But we had done our junior year at LA County, and the senior year we had an invitation to come back out to the farm. And the question was, were you going to get enough clinical training? There was no dearth of clinical training out here. We did things that probably shouldn't be reported, but we learned an awful lot.
Very good.
I was not present at the move. I left the Friday before to head to Boston, and the move was on the following Sunday, so I missed out the logistics of that particular episode.
Very good. John, let me come to you. You were graduated in 64 and came back as, well, you're in the service for a while.
Actually, Varner Johns was very persuasive, and I know he talked to me about coming out to be in the first group of interns starting in 64, and Monty to be one of the first internal medicine residents. And I actually followed Monty into internal medicine. I started in 65, and 10 months into that first year of internal medicine training, I got drafted. So from 1966 to 68, I was in the Army, and actually at the time of the move from the sanitarium to the new hospital, I was operating a medical aid station out of a tent in Vietnam. So I have to say that not only was there a pretty significant structural change from when I left to when I came back, but there was a cultural change, and I'd just like to thank some of the faculty who came to Loma Linda, because when I came back, there were a number of subspecialists in internal medicine that had not been there when I left in 66. And I'll never forget, I was doing a rotation with Stewart Chanko, and in addition to Stewart teaching me the latest information in nephrology, I watched him pray with patients. And he did that over and over. And I knew at that point that I was in the right place.
Very nice. It was good to see George Burton on the video. George was with you, a pulmonologist here at the assistant, was our actually class sponsor for my class in 1970, I remember. Now he's back at Kettering, he's been there for a number of years. So,
yeah, when I came back, as George mentioned, he started the day they moved in the new hospital, and he was a new subspecialist in internal medicine. Long story short, he talked to me about going into pulmonary critical care medicine, which I did, and I never regretted.
Yeah. And you know, you're looking back, you think of what Varner Johns did, actually tapping people on the shoulder, getting many of you out into subspecialist areas, ready to come back and populate this hospital when we needed it.
Right.
Monty, you were a resident back then.
I was, and I'd like to mention Varner Johns again. He started in on us in our junior year. And then in the senior year, he had our lives all set out for us. And he called me and he said, now I want you to take your internship here at the White, and then I'm going to arrange for you to take a hematology program when you finish the residency. And so I got a hematology book and got all fired up. He found Irv Kuhn, and so then he said, you know, I think you'd make a good liver specialist. So I got a liver book, and I couldn't get interested. So Dr. Rosenquist said, don't listen to him. You take what you want to take. So I took it. But Varner was a real pioneer. He picked out people, started with John, and John and I and one other fellow were the first three, met up on the old hospital for worship the first morning of his internship, my residency. It's wonderful days.
Yeah, wonderful days.
Yeah.
Any final comments from all of you? Ignore that clock down there. Any more comments you want to share in terms of some of those memories?
We talk a lot about the hospital, but I like what Harvey said. It was the atmosphere.
Yeah.
We felt that we'd joined a winning team. Yeah. When I was at the White for my internship, the chief of medicine there said, we want you to stay here. And I said, no, I'm going to Loma Linda. Why don't you come with us? And he said, oh, by the time they get things going out there, I'll be an old man. So it was the young men that came out.
Yeah. And Lynn, you had just come from Australia not too long before this.
Yes, I was going to comment that I came in July of '66. And the first year I was here, I had to take the medical students to the county hospital in San Bernardino to teach them physical diagnosis. There were not enough PEDS patients. And what a contrast the following year with a growing, blooming pediatric population to be able to do it all in the hospital was quite remarkable.
Very good. Any final comments from any of the rest of you? Burton?
You know, the question came up was, would we get enough education out here? We did the obstetrics rotation over at Riverside County. And if any of you are acquainted with an obstetrics ward, a labor ward, there was a room for the house staff, and then there were labor rooms down the hall. You could lie in a bed when you were not actively delivering patients and listen to the patients down the hall. Oh my, oh my. When it changed to, oh Lordy, you knew you had to get up and move. One time we were so fatigued, we went down and the only empty bed was in one of the labor rooms. And I had just about fallen to sleep, and the door opened, and one nurse said to the other, now this patient in here needs prep and enema. I tell you, it didn't take long to wake up. But we had a good time. And I don't think the move in any way hurt the education that the medical students got.
Another part of Loma Linda's history that's always fascinating to me is the interaction we've had with the U.S. military through the years. We had the 43rd Army Hospital, went to Papua New Guinea, many things. But you saw in the move, the military was here and helped us very much as part of that move as well. And a bunch of the medics came from the bases around here and helped to make that move. So, Dale?
One comment I wanted to make is, since I was here and took pictures, the bus, the ambulances, and some of the trucks were painted United States Air Force blue. So we should give credit to the Air Force for the help that they gave us. Many people don't remember that there were hospitals both on Norton Air Force Base and March, and they helped out. If anybody wants to know, I have proof.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you all very much for the role you played in making this happen. And let me move over to this group. Because as you can imagine, it takes more than doctors to make a hospital work. And these were some of the folks that were behind the scenes making this happen. Please stand, can you? Let me start, Gerhard, with you. You weren't not working here at that point in time. Gerhard Studel is now in charge of our grounds and keeps this beautiful campus looking like it does. But you've told me stories about your dad.
Well, like you said, Dr. Hart, I wasn't working here at the time, but my dad was in campus engineering. And in fact, he hung a lot of doors and cabinets in the towers. And that Sunday morning, he said, hey, look, why don't you come along with us and maybe you can help. Well, the university had a little VW microbus, and that's what we used to transport the ambulatory patients. And we were able to fit about 4 patients a thing at a time, and I believe we made about 3 trips. Now, the only thing they had me do was hang on the wheelchairs to keep them from rolling down the hill. Anyways, but that was kind of interesting experience. One thing I do remember there was one gentleman, he was very concerned that his bill was going to just go skyrocket because he's got to be put into the new hospital, but the nurses assured him that wouldn't happen. But it was an interesting experience.
Thank you. Maxine.
Yes, sir.
My goodness. Maxine Darling is now 90.
90. Don't make it older.
90.
Gee. Oh, my.
Was a nurse in the OR back at that time and is still working some. Is that correct?
That's correct. The Bible says you're supposed to work 6 days a week. Well, I don't work 6 days a week. I just do 3.
So you were here during the move. Hold the mic up a bit closer.
Okay.
Tell us about, you were here during the move and working at that point in time.
Yes, I was here 50 years ago. I was young then, very young. And I think that Dr. Briggs will agree with me that anesthesia was really different at that time. Man, they used such things as ether, cyclopropane, and these things were very explosive. I mean, it'd blow you out of the room. Well, anyway, because of these explosive gases, we had to have an entirely different aspect of what we would do and how we would work with these explosive gases. So we went into the fact that we needed really to be conductive with everything. Gee, we didn't want to go to our maker because of an explosion. So we had everything conductive, even had shoe covers that had a strip on the bottom that made us conductive. Our floors were conductive, and we had to test them once a month to make sure that they were positive. Oh, the work we went through to make sure that everything was okay so that we wouldn't blow up. Well, I think that we went along pretty well. I forgot to tell you that at that time, I was the OR supervisor. So a lot of things fell upon my shoulders to do. And I had to make certain that my staff did all the things that they were supposed to do. I was mean but kind. And I shouldn't tell you about myself. I don't. Okay. We were going to move to the new promised land. And so the night before, I thought, because I'm in charge, I better get myself up there and make sure that everything is okay. You know, everything, suction's working, all that. And I thought, because, excuse me, because we had problems with the conductive floors, I thought maybe I'd better have those checked once more for make sure they were positive. Well, everything went pretty good till we got to room 8. And would you know, that floor would not test out. Oh, we did everything. We stripped it, we mopped it and all that. And I don't know how, but somehow word got down to Mahogany Row that there was trouble in the operating room with conductivity. And up came the administrators. Well, they were of no help. No offense.
That's still true.
Yeah. So, well, anyway, the chief engineer and I stood there in room 8. What shall we do? And he had the idea, I got an idea. Let's bathe the floor in almost pure ammonia. Whoa. I can tell you, we could hardly breathe. And our noses and eyes, I thought they'd never be the same again. But we were happy. The floor proved positive. So anyway, that got me out of that one. The next morning, we were to move to the promised land. And I thought, oh boy, I hope everything will go well with us. And I think there's a film somewhere with Turner moving in storage and Air Force Base helped move us. Well, in the operating room, we decided that we would move our own instruments, excuse me, and supplies. And it was quite a job. I mean, we worked hard that day. I mean, we worked hard all day long, moving these instruments and moving all of these supplies over.
Were you ready to do surgery the next day, or how long did it take to?
Well, we pretty well had it arranged. We decided we were going to put all these instruments in the new recovery room. And so we got our stuff going all day long. We pretty well got things there by the end of the day. And I hated to admit it, but by the end of the day, I was tired. And
Thank you, Maxine, for the service you provided through the years and still continue to provide. It's a real privilege still to have you on the staff. Bob.
Yes, sir.
You were running the lab back in those days, as I recall. Bob Loader, tell us about that.
That's what I was doing. When I arrived here in 1967, I heard about Loma Linda in 1964 when they first started digging the hole. I was working at Batty State TV in Rome, Georgia, and I got this call from a pathologist, and he said, "Bob, I need you." I said, "Well, I don't need you. I'm staying in Georgia." So he called in 64. I said, no. 65, he called. 66, I started weakening a little bit. I said, well, maybe. And so in 67, I told Jimmy, I said, if he calls again, let's go to Loma Linda. The road goes back. We can come back to Georgia anytime we get ready to go. And so I said, okay, I'll come. So here I am, 50 years later. And when I arrived, let me tell you, I never saw so much of a space in my life. I'm used to working in laboratories where there are 12 by 12 rooms, and we're all in there together. I came out here, and 8th to 9th floor, it wasn't even finished. I said, my goodness, what are they doing up there? They was using storage on 8th and 9th. I couldn't believe it. Well, that didn't last long. They filled up pretty quick. So I go to the laboratory, and I'm not kidding. I could lay down on the benches and not hit anything. We had no equipment. It was a bare bone operation. So we immediately started putting things together, and we knew computers were coming, and so they sent me to Alabama, University of Alabama, on the pretext of taking a management course. I was supposed to sneak into the lab in the evenings and find out what they were doing with their computers. Well, I did that, and so what they were doing, the Hollerith card. You ever heard of a Hollerith card? It was designed for the national census. It was about that long and 82 spaces or something. They would do a CBC, type that into the card, and 8 o'clock the next night or that evening, you would type it out and send the report to the floor. Well, the phones were ringing off the hook. Where's the hemoglobins? Well, we don't know. We sent it downstairs, you know. So anyway, that's what happened. And I came out here. We put the lab together, and now it's completely automated. It's unbelievable. If any of you want to go up and take a look, it is unbelievable what they've got today. And Maxine and I I've always, whoops.
Okay,
Oh, I'm
easy
sorry.
one. Okay.
I'm just trying to give you a hug.
Well, we often hug.
We go way back, 50 years, and her and I have seen a lot of combat because we lived on the same floor, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
Yes, we did. And I'll tell you what, we'd go off in the corners and cry sometime because of things that was going wrong, and we couldn't get administration to give us the time of day, you know. So anyway, it's been a wonderful experience for me. These 50 years I got a lot of memories, and I remember meeting this fella when he was running the SAC clinic a long time ago.
Long time ago.
Long time ago.
Well, thank you to every one of you. What an incredible history, folks. And we have one more video, I believe. Thank you. You can go off.
The entire field of medicine, literally from A to Z, is completely different now than it was 50 years ago. The clinical milestones that have happened along the way, there are some obviously very, very important ones, and ones that are really, I think, iconic in Loma Linda history. Certainly the Judkin's angiography technique, the heart transplantation program, along with Baby Faye, Proton Therapy, the development of that center.
The world's first proton cancer center is nearing completion at Loma Linda University Medical Center in Southern California.
Proton therapy is actually a breakthrough that was developed and made clinically relevant 25 years ago here at Loma Linda. That was long before the idea of targeted therapies in cancer was around.
We were injuring too much normal tissue with our radiation, and that wasn't necessary. We could do much better than that.
That really was a development that completely changed the direction that the field of cancer was moving in, to now being a very fine-tuned, targeted approach to treating cancer. Back then, that wasn't even thought of. Our relationship as a university with the VA is incredibly important. Research that has gone on and the teaching and the clinical care because of the collaboration between the VA hospital and the university has been just amazing.
From ABC News, this is the Weekend Report.
Doctors specializing in immunology and organ transplants today praised the so far successful transplanting of a baboon heart into the body of a baby girl who was certain to die.
Pediatric heart transplant is really an area where Loma Linda has truly blazed a trail. Certainly Dr. Bailey is an icon, a legend in the field of pediatric transplant.
I wondered if the doctor was a mad scientist. I'm sure I had the same reaction as anybody else who first heard it. But when you get right down to it, it's just an organ. And it's a life-saving organ.
I and my colleagues believe Baby Faye has opened new vistas for all, including the as yet unborn infants with similar lethal heart disease. The Baby Fays and their parents are the real pioneers in this quest to enrich our quality of life.
Really, I think all of the transplantation advances and high-level care that we're able to give here really traces back to the really groundbreaking work that Dr. Bailey did. Perinatal biology is another of those fields where science and clinical care really have interacted so well here at Loma Linda. Dr. Longo is one of the longest continuously funded scientists in the history of the National Institutes of Health. And certainly for decades and decades, he led to new breakthroughs in what makes both mothers and infants more healthy. And so having the kind of the scientific infrastructure that Dr. Longo established together with the children's services embodied by the Children's Hospital has really been a powerful thing.
Judkins published his first cornea angiogram paper in 1967.
Right after I went to Loma Linda, there was such a welcoming atmosphere in Judkins' department. There are times we would have people from all over the world watching us do coronary angiography. You do procedures and you run into problems, and those problems say, how can I solve this?
Delivering whole person care is probably something that Loma Linda is more well known for than technological things like transplant or proton. And I think what Dr. Alexander did is he not only taught just generations of medical students and other healthcare providers how to incorporate that into your practice, he actually demonstrated it himself. Over many years, he became recognized as a world authority. Loma Linda has had for a long time as its motto to make man whole. Dr. Alexander probably put that into practice better than anyone else, more than just a motto of a few words can do. He showed how to actually do that with patients. I was actually fortunate to be able to take quite a number of courses from Graham Maxwell, and I can honestly say that he is the most influential person spiritually in my life. And I have spoken with literally thousands of other people who have taken classes from him, how they provide health care and how they view God. And that really has a huge impact on the communities that they then live in. And they go out and they share not only their knowledge about healthcare, but they share the truth about God. And so Graham Maxwell, I think, is one of the most influential people that has ever taught here. You know, these clinical milestones, when you put them all together, have been enormous in the fields of cancer, of heart disease, neurosciences. Those really do have an impact on the major causes of death in the United States. So I'm actually very optimistic that just as happened back in the 60s, here in 2020, I think the same thing is going to happen to Loma Linda. It'll transform the place and we won't recognize it again.
We want to talk a little bit now about the last 50 years and what's happened during that time. And these people have all been part of that. So not only did we start a hospital in '67, but we've created an incredible history in this hospital. Let's leverage this for the future. So let me start. Let me introduce everybody first. Dr. Lynn Bailey, I think most of you know, that's been in the video, and we'll get to him in a second. Dr. Eric Sow, radiologist, not a graduate from Loma Linda, but came here for fellowship and has been on our faculty. Will tell us some about that. Dr. John Mace, a longtime chair of pediatrics. Dr. Bill Pierce has been part of Dr. Larry Longo's lab. As you know, we lost Dr. Longo about 1.5 years ago now, but Bill has been here for many years. Will tell us about that. And Dr. Richard Paul, some of you may not remember, but Dr. Paul was here for a long time with Dr. Hahn in establishing the fetal heart monitoring system. So we'll get to that. So let me start with you, Eric. Tell us what it was like in Dr. Judkins' lab and some of what was happening then.
Well, first of all, I have to say that it's a very humbling experience standing here to see all the giants that preceded us to make Loma Linda what it is today. And if I can just take a few minutes, Dr. Judkins became chairman of the radiology department in 1970 and was recruited by Dr. Hinshaw Sr. A year later, I came to do a fellowship under him. And what I saw was an imposing persona. He was a solid tower of strength. And he had a certain presence about him, so much so that we always kept a respectable distance. But inside of all that, he had an inner graciousness and generosity, and it was a pleasure to serve under this giant in radiology. Now, to me, it is more than fortuitousness that Dr. Judkins came here. And I'll explain to you in a minute. He had a very simple young life, cared for animals in the farm, but he had two special aptitudes. One is he loved to tinker, and he loved to invent things. But he also had a special talent to go into medicine, and fortunately for us, he did. He trained and then joined the Army to repay his debt and was sent to Japan. And of all things, it may not be well known, he was head of urology. I suppose that played a part because he became very familiar with catheters. But then he returned to family practice and got overwhelmed. So he moved to another location. And his empty office became very excited when the first patient showed up. They treated it with special attention and took good care of it, and he decided not to charge the patient anything because that first patient happened to be a dog. But again, he became overwhelmed and decided to go something nice and quiet. So he picked radiology. And then of all the numerous residency available, he chose Oregon, where Dr. Charles Daughter was working. And Dr. Daughter had a special interest in blood vessel disease. Now, right at that time, let's move on to Cleveland Clinic. Dr. Mason Soames, who is a big name in cardiology, was first of all starting to do studies of the coronary artery. But you got to remember, there was a strict taboo about putting a catheter into coronary artery. Any mere mortal that dared to put a catheter into the coronary artery will hear what would sound like an Old Testament injunction. The patient shall surely die. So they stood clear from the coronary artery, but they would inject contrast in the aortic root. And one day, as the catheter kind of recoiled around, inadvertently, it jumped into the coronary artery. And promptly, the patient had a cardiac arrest. But fortunately, the patient was resuscitated. So that was the inauspicious beginning of coronary angiography. Now, Dr. Judkins heard about it and said, I've got to learn about coronary angiography and see if I can make some improvements. So as you saw the picture, he invented 3 catheters. He spent countless hours in the lab and devoted his life and come up with 3 catheters, one for each coronary artery, and the third one had a quaint name. If you notice, it had a little curl, and he called that the pigtail catheter, because that stopped the catheter from whipping around when it injected contrast in the ventricle. And of course, the rest is history. And that's why I think it was more than fortuitousness. In fact, it has to be providential, that this whole chain of events converge together to make what Dr. Judkins is and for his major contribution to Loma Linda.
Thank you. And it's good to see Charlie Simmons on the video.
Yes, he was also my mentor when we did the fellowship here.
His wife recently passed away, and he didn't feel like he could travel.
He's a prince of a gentleman. Loved working with him.
Let me go, John. Dr. Mace, my goodness. We already heard back in my day when we began 6 members of the pediatric department, now 200. You were the architect of that, and over many years you said there's a vision to have a children's hospital and to grow pediatrics. Tell us about that.
I was not the architect. The architect was geography, because the only decent children's hospital at that time was LA Children's. And as everybody moved here, getting into LA Children's was impossible almost. So all I had to do was recruit a specialist, and we were busy. And then I had sense enough to recruit Dr. Chenik, who came, and Dr. Chenik, his father, recruited me. And it was interesting because he would send me a letter once a week for, I don't know, months. And I would toss it because when you finish from medical school, you don't have the fondest memories of those times. A lot of time and study. But finally, my wife said, well, at least open it. So I opened it up, and all it says is, John, we need you. I called him, and he said, I'll be in the clinic Sunday. Why don't you come up and see me? So I came up, and he showed me around, and then he told me what he would pay me. And I said, well, do I need to sign something if I want to do that? He said, no, the best contract you're ever going to get is the handshake of an honest man. and I think that's true. The other thing I'd like to finish with is we're all here basically, if you ask me, one man that made the difference was Dave Hinshaw Sr. He not only recruited me whenever I needed anything, go to him and it would get done. And the best advice that I ever had in my life, and probably ever will have, is when he appointed me chairman. He talked to me for about 20 minutes in his office, telling me things to do and not to do. But as I'm leaving, he says, John, one more thing. The enemy of excellent is not bad or poor, it's mediocrity, and don't get it in your system. So whenever you recruit somebody, if you think he's average, you don't recruit him.
Thank you, John. Just one more thing. I mean, it was sometime, in the late 70s, you guys started thinking about a children's hospital.
Yes.
I know, Lynn, you were involved
Yes.
in that discussion. Dr. Hinshaw was supportive. And that's when the whole idea of having our own children's hospital started.
Yes, yes. But as I say, we just needed bed, because...
You were taking over the rest of the hospital, so we had to build you one of your own. Yeah.
No, but thank you.
Very good. Bill, let me go to you. One of the things that was part of that new hospital was the research wing. And Dr. Longo came back and started anchoring the whole perinatal research area. You've been here for many years as part of that.
35.
35 years. Tell us a bit of that history of the research in the wing.
So Larry started off sort of on his own, and then he very quickly found an old friend, comrade from Penn, Gordon Power. Gordon Power came in. Gordon Power was a respiratory physiologist, and two of them started out, and they realized that they needed someone to do the heart. So they got Ray Gilbert. And so Ray Gilbert was the sort of the troika for them to get their first set of grants. And so now they got some grants, they got some attention. They were all in the visibility of National Institutes of Health. And Larry went to Hinshaw and said, boy, I need another person. And Dr. Hinshaw said, well, okay, just one more. And so he added one more, and first thing you know, there were 6 of us, and that was including Steve Yellen and Charlie Ducey and me. And then Larry said, well, in order for us to really make sure that we're worthwhile, we need to have a big program project grant. That's not the little grant, that's the equivalent of like 4 or 5 different grants that runs a whole center. Those are the grants that are, over $1 million a year. So what we did is we had a very, very small faculty, and with that first program project grant, and the first try didn't work, but we went in again and got it, and that same grant is now running to this very day, and we're going to run out through 25 years before too long. So the brilliant idea was, well, okay, let's get a bunch of different people with different disciplines, bring them together, and all study the fetus. And Larry had a very strong reputation in placental physiology, and then he took that to, he extrapolated that to the fact that, boy, placental insufficiency, hypoxia is a big problem, so let's study hypoxia. So we have this wonderful facility at the Barcroft Station. We have a chronic hypoxia model, and so, Charlie did one thing, and, I did the cerebral circulation, and Ray did the coronary, et cetera, and NIH liked it, and they still like it, and so the idea, it's a very unique model, and because of that, we started off with just the most simplistic kinds of explanation, and now we've stayed pace, and now we're looking at genetic manipulation and how the environment affects the genome, and so it continues to grow. And I have to say it was a really wonderful environment, because if there was one thing that was characteristic of Larry and his leadership, is he valued scholarship over everything else. If you didn't read, if you weren't going to meetings, if you weren't nationally, in the spotlight in some way or another, you weren't really properly doing your job. And so that we brought in lots of speakers from many different places all over the country, and everyone, for a young guy like me, I just came from UCLA, I thought, wow, this is really first rate. And so I got to meet a lot of people. I wound up on study sections getting funded, just like all the other people there, and that created a tradition that I think is the sort of the hallmark of excellence that everyone associates with perinatal.
We celebrated Larry's 40th year a couple of years ago.
Just a couple of years ago.
How many postdoctoral fellows have you all put through that program now?
Oh, well, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 50. Okay, so we've had a lot of people, and
Scattered all over the world now.
yeah, and what was so wonderful is that, you know, Larry is very, very closely associated. Many of us are counselors with the Society for, Gynecological Investigation. That's the home for fetal physiology, and there were 6 past presidents of that society that came to our 40th. It was really
amazing.
Kind of a fun event.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Let me go to Dr. Paul. Our oldest daughter was born in 1971. Chandra came home to our little house on Yardley Place with 2 little pinpricks on the top of her scalp, caused by you guys, I think. Tell us about that.
Your daughter's scalp. Well, the story is, I guess, an interesting one that relates to Dr. Hahn, who you
He was a
showed.
brief picture in the video, yes.
Yeah, and I, in 1961, began a residency at the White Memorial, and obstetrics at that time was pretty simplistic. You listen to the baby's heartbeat every 15 minutes, 30 minutes. Everything's fine. You could go back an hour later and there wasn't any heartbeat. I was then exposed to Ed Hahn's original work at the White Memorial. He had come there from Yale in 1960 or 59 or 60, and investigating the area of fetal condition. Dr. Reeves talked about revolutions. Fetal medicine, neonatal medicine has truly been pretty exciting, and a few of us up here have experienced that spectrum, but the initial attempts then to monitor the baby's heartbeat, Dr. Hahn was an innovator and a thoughtful person who could come up with ideas and electronic ideas. I was a clinician, so I got to really explore and introduce that technique pretty much beginning clinically in about 1969 when I had returned from Yale. Following my residency, I came here to practice for 1 year with Harold Ziprick. Then I went to Yale. Then I went in the military at their request, back to Yale, and then with a joint appointment at Loma Linda and USC with a group, Hahn, Quilligan, and those people. The initial attempts to get fetal heart rate then were from a scalp clip that was just clipped onto the baby's scalp. And the pediatricians didn't particularly like that in the nursery because there was an occasional complication. But overall, that all evolved to where the technique of fetal monitoring pretty much is ubiquitous in this country, certainly. We tried at one time to do a study, interestingly, in the 60s, where we could have a controlled study. And Dr. Hahn, Dr. Quilligan had applied to NIH for that. There were no IRBs, there were no informed consents, and a controlled randomized study was turned down because it was unethical. And today, the technique still remains, at least in many people's minds, questionable, but the lesion on the scalp was from a scalp electrode, and it's probably used in less than 10% now because, again, the evolution of the techniques and the technology is so much better. And now we can get an idea of what the baby is like and hand it off to our neonatal colleagues. And of course, ultrasound has revolutionized the whole area of fetal echocardiography. You know what's coming before they come out, whereas when I was trained, you just handed the baby off, and these poor guys had to resuscitate it and take care of it after the fact. So that was a story that I could tell you about Ed Hahn.
Thank you, and appreciate you and Dr. Hahn. Let me go, Lynn, to you last. I've heard you tell your story to the medical students many times about, actually about not getting into medicine and then getting into medicine and then the career you've had since then. And obviously the Baby Faye experience, Lynn, is part of what took this institution to a whole other level. Tell us some of the struggles you went through and experimenting with that idea, the baboon issue, and so on.
Thank you for that. I'd really rather listen to these folks. It occurred to me that while we were populating this cloverleaf building up here, there was a fellow named Chris Barnard in Cape Town lacing a heart in an individual by the name of Washi Waskansky. And then 3 days later, up in New York, Adrian Kantritz sewed a heart in a newborn baby. Now, neither one of those operations succeeded ultimately, but they were tremendously stimulating. And I was surrounded by all this inspiration. You brought a lot of it up here today. It seemed to me that with proper training, we might be able to help a number of these babies who otherwise had no chance. And so we began working in the laboratory on that. We operated on baby goats. When we run out of money, I would take a couple of these baby goats with new hearts up and run them through Dr. Branson's office. And they'd prance around a little and leave a deposit and come on back down the hall. Branson would write another check so that we would have the laboratory running. And by, we needed to translate that experience into clinical outcomes. We had babies that were still dying with univentricular heart disease because nothing could be done for them. And so we got that opportunity finally to, after considerable debate with the IRB, to go forward with cross-species transplant. Had to start somewhere. True, it sounded like I was a mad scientist, and I'm sure a lot of people thought of that. But there was actually some science behind it. And I'd like to have Baby Faye back. I think that if we'd been able to do everything just right, she'd have done a lot better and gone a lot longer. But you had to start somewhere. It was utter chaos on the campus. I don't know whether you remember any of that or not. But we survived that as well. And then a year or so later, I got word from an obstetrician in the Bay Area that they had a newborn baby with brain death. The parents had heard about Baby Faye, and they wanted to donate that baby's heart. Were we still in the transplant business? And I said, well, I don't know. Let me run down the hall and see if we're in the transplant business. So I ran down the hall, and sure enough, there was a baby with hypoplastic left heart syndrome off in the corner dying. They eventually called him Baby Moses. So I said, yeah, I think we might be in the transplant business. That mother had had a baby the year before who died of a similar heart defect. And so we brought the baby down from the Bay Area, and we did Baby Moses transplant. And Baby Moses, who is really Eddie, will be 32 this year with that same heart. So it managed to launch emphasis on newborn babies where we have an advantage with solid organ transplant. And that sort of caught on around the world. I'm pleased to think that Loma Linda at least started some of that.
Thank you, Lenny. Thank you to each one of these. Incredible history over the last 50 years.
I want it to be a beacon of hope. I want it to be a beacon of healing. We are here to better our fellow mankind and to make this an environment where people can come for not just medical care, but healing. And that means body, mind, and soul. The fact of the matter is, as we look at the building of this new hospital, we're spending more than $1.5 billion.
This is a huge, huge undertaking for an organization. We would never do a construction project like this. We would phase it normally. But it's because of the state mandate that we have to meet certain seismic requirements that we are doing this all at once.
We don't have the choice about whether we build a new hospital or not. We either build a new hospital or we close our doors. People tend to think of building projects in terms of steel and the structure itself. You tend not to think about all of the steps that had to fall in place before the first shovel of dirt ever got moved. The sequence of events that led up to putting in place each piece of the financing for this building are truly a series of miracles.
That sequence of events where everything got accomplished just in time. We had never done our audit that fast before. We needed the licensure. We needed the chaff of money. All that just went in sequence. And then the icing on the cake is when we went out to the market, it was the best rates could have gotten in decades.
When we were doing our initial projections for the bond financing, we had assumptions for interest rate at 6.5%. And miracle of all miracles, we closed at 4.84%, and that saved the organization over $135 million in interest costs.
You look back and did that all just fall into place? So many of them were, we knew there was God's hand in it because they're outside our control.
Vision 2020 is a comprehensive campaign that Loma Linda is undertaking. It's a campaign of about $360+ million from the philanthropic side.
A lot of us questioned if that could ever be done. Our largest campaign before, I believe, was approximately $65 million.
This campaign to stretch to that amount is a huge undertaking.
The Troche's initial gift of $100 million is amazing in its commitment to the mission and work of this institution.
It got the attention of many people in the community and around really the country. So there's been so many experiences from very large gifts to very small gifts. And I think, wow, what an incredible experience to have people be able to make a difference. They're securing a future in incredible care for this community in really amazing ways.
We have raised to date, in July of 2017, more than $265 million. That is an amazing accomplishment for this institution. The heart of a hospital is how it is designed to be user-friendly for the clinician, but most importantly for the patient.
I'm excited about the patient-centric care. It's all about the patient. From a healthcare delivery perspective and from the experience in its entirety.
One of the principal features built into our new hospital is that every single room is private. And that's a big deal for families and for patients.
In the new hospital, with one patient in a room, designated parent space will have place for both parents to sleep if they choose to do so. That is one of the aspects I'm really looking forward to.
And remember, our mission is to continue the teaching and healing ministry of Jesus Christ. So we made a very intentional decision to make the rooms bigger because it will accommodate medical students and residents and nursing students and respiratory therapy students, the whole panoply of professionals that we are training for the next generation.
One of the things that I'm excited about as a cardiologist is the new Heart Institute. It's going to be blowing up. It's going to be huge. It's going to be state of the art.
That glass that they're going to put out front that's going to change as the sun sets. It's going to be beautiful.
This is a healing environment. In everything about the building, we have tried to be thoughtful about healing as we move to expand and grow and develop Loma Linda, not just to become a large provider, not just to become the biggest hospital in the region. Our goal must be to continue the healing ministry that this institution is so famous for, and that must be what drives us.
I'm sure that there are people that you interview that have a long legacy here at Loma Linda and can tell you about the last 50 years. And I don't know how many people you can interview who've only been here a short amount of time. But I can tell you as somebody who has worked in 5 different states in this country and probably at 10 or 12 different medical centers, there is no other medical center like this one. And the commitment they have to people and to the integrity and for doing things the right way, it is not a catchphrase, and it is not trendy. It is something they've been doing for 100 years, and I have no doubt they'll do for another 100 years.
And so we stand this afternoon on the cusp of another era for Loma Linda. What will the next 50 years bring? What will we look like? What will medicine look like? The changes that are taking place. It's uncanny to look right now for me and recognize the similarities between now and 50 years ago. We got social unrest in the country. We got racial tensions. We've got uncertainty on healthcare financing. Where is it going? What's going to happen? We've got one Loma Linda. Back then, they were facing a physical relocation to come together. Today, we're trying to organizationally bring this organization together to be one Loma Linda. And cost, $22 million. They came in under budget. Carrie, $1.5 billion now we're looking at for all the things that will go into this new hospital. A challenge unlike any that we have ever faced. So the challenge is huge for us, folk, but we appreciate the history that we're standing on and what it means. I'd like to invite several groups to stand this afternoon. First, those of you who are in some of the videos. Some of you are here. I think I saw Dr. Herber, Dr. Thompson. Would all of you who have been in one of the videos please stand? Anthony Hilliard in the back, Dr. Thompson over here, Mark Reeves, Dr. Herber, Angela, Kevin, Rochelle, thank you. And we've got some former administrators here. Lynn, please stand again. Dr. Behrens, so instrumental in carrying us to this point. Dave Moorhead, so long here. Where are you, Dave? Dave Moorhead over here, president of our hospital for some time. Who else is here? Steve Moore, I heard you were coming. Is Steve here? I don't see him. John Ruffcorn, where are you? Here he is, president of the hospital for many years. And we've got some vice presidents here doing that. Let me have all the administrators of the hospital, let's go to the old administrators first. All of you who are served in an administrative role here at the hospital over the last 50 years, would you please stand? That's why we're in trouble. Okay. Norm Meyer, thank you. Norm was significant out on the East Campus. Let me ask, how many of you were here while the hospital was being built or during the move? How many of you were here on the campus at that point in time? Would you please stand? There's the blue zone at work right there, folk. Thank you for being that. Let me now have our current administrators stand. Those of you who are now in leadership positions here at the hospital, would you please stand and let us thank you for what all is happening at this place. As has been mentioned, we have done well on this campaign, far better than, frankly, many of us thought we would by this point in time. We're at, I think the latest figure, Rochelle, 267-something million. Almost 75% of our goal of 360. There are many different groups who have helped to make that happen. These are primarily volunteers, people who come together, who strategize in different ways to put this campaign together. And I want to recognize those. Let me just mention a few of them. We have some of our Board of Trustees are here. We have our university counselors. We have our President's Advisory Cabinet, Campaign Steering Committee, the Children's Hospital Foundation Board, and our guild members. Would all of you, if you're one of those groups, would you please stand and let us thank you for what you've done to get us this far on the campaign. Thank you very much. And let me remind you, we're not done yet. The last 100 million, I'm told, is the toughest million. 100 million, so we've got a long ways to go. But what a history that's been created as we put this together. Thank you all for being here with us this afternoon and sharing in this incredible story of how Loma Linda has come through the past 50 years and what it has meant to this community and, frankly, to the world. And I'd like to invite Carrie Heinrich, our hospital administrator, to come up and give us a final blessing.
We truly stand on the shoulders of giants. The highlight of my career will have been to have served with Dave Hinshaw Sr., who was so instrumental in the decisions to move from Los Angeles to Loma Linda. And as Dr. Hart started by saying, we have nothing to fear for the future lest we forget the way the Lord has led us in the past. We are here because God has watched over this institution and has led. I'm incredibly grateful for the leadership, the commitment, the dedication of so many people that have made this happen. And as we look to the future, I am staggered by the fact that we will spend more on the lobbies of the new hospital than we spent on the entire Cloverleaf Hospital. But that's just the nature of inflation and the way costs change. But I'd like for us to bow our heads and to take a moment to thank God for his leading, for his guidance, and his watch care of this institution. Let's bow our heads. Father, this is your institution. This is your place. In fact, this is the very place that you showed Ellen White 112 years ago. May we be true to that mission. May we put our energies, our thoughts, our wisdom, our energy towards continuing the teaching and healing ministry of Jesus Christ. Thank you for how you have led us in the past. May we hold on to you as we look to the future. Amen.
Thank you all for being here. Am I correct? There's a reception back behind here? I'm looking for some nods out here. I think I'm right on that. Yes. So back behind the fellowship hall, please join us and enjoy the fellowship. Many of you have not seen each other for some time, so enjoy that as well. Thank you for coming.